May 8, 1945 marked the end of Nazi Germany's reign of terror across Europe, but for a select group of Wehrmacht generals, their war was about to take an unexpectedly peculiar turn. As Allied forces swept through the crumbling Third Reich, high-ranking German officers found themselves facing a future they had never imagined: captivity in the hands of their enemies. Among them were some of the most decorated and feared military minds of the German war machine. Men who had commanded divisions across continents, orchestrated campaigns that had reshaped the map of Europe, and now stood stripped of their power, their armies dissolved into the chaos of defeat. The spring air carried the acrid smell of burning documents as German headquarters across the collapsing front frantically destroyed evidence of their operations. General der Panzertruppe Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, who had fought in Spain, Poland, France, and North Africa, watched the Allied tanks roll into view with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had survived Rommel's Africa Corps and Montgomery's relentless pursuit, only to find himself now at the mercy of victors whose treatment of prisoners remained uncertain in his mind. The Geneva Convention promised humane treatment, but von Thoma had witnessed enough of war's brutality to know that paper promises often dissolved in the face of vengeance and hatred. Similar scenes unfolded across what remained of Germany. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, had just signed the unconditional surrender documents at Reims. The weight of Germany's defeat rested heavily on his shoulders, as American military police escorted him and other high-ranking officers toward waiting vehicles. These men, accustomed to commanding respect and wielding absolute authority over millions of soldiers, now shuffled forward with uncertain steps, their crisp uniforms still bearing the insignia of a regime that had ceased to exist. The Allied command faced a unique challenge. Unlike ordinary prisoners of war, these generals possessed intimate knowledge of German military operations, strategic planning, and the inner workings of Hitler's command structure. Their intelligence value was immeasurable, but their cooperation was far from guaranteed. The question facing Allied interrogators was not simply how to extract information, but how to create conditions that would encourage these proud, defeated officers to speak freely about their experiences and knowledge. As documented in various historical accounts from the United States National Archives, including interrogation reports and facility records from this period, the American military had been developing a sophisticated approach to handling high-value prisoners. Traditional interrogation methods, threats, deprivation, and intimidation, had proven unreliable with educated, disciplined officers who had been trained to resist such tactics. Instead, a more subtle strategy was taking shape, one that would become known among military intelligence circles as the luxury treatment. The German generals being rounded up in those final days of the war had no knowledge of what awaited them. They expected, at best, austere prison camps with basic rations and harsh conditions. Many feared summary execution or show trials followed by the gallows. The Nuremberg trials were already being discussed in Allied circles, and the fate of Nazi leadership seemed sealed. These officers, some complicit in war crimes and others merely professional soldiers caught in the machinery of an evil regime, contemplated their uncertain futures as trucks carried them toward American-controlled territory. None could have predicted that their captivity would involve something as absurdly American as ice-cold Coca-Cola. The convoy of vehicles carrying the captured German generals wound through the devastated German countryside toward a destination known only to their American escorts. General Major Reinhard Gehlen, former head of German military intelligence on the Eastern Front, sat in silence, his analytical mind already calculating possibilities. He understood that his knowledge of Soviet military capabilities and operations made him valuable to the Americans, but he couldn't predict how they would approach extracting that information. Beside him, General Lieutenant Hans von Greifenberg, former Chief of Staff to Army Group Center, stared out at the ruins of towns they passed, processing the magnitude of Germany's destruction. Their destination was a place that would become legendary in the annals of military intelligence history. A luxurious interrogation facility that represented a radical departure from conventional prisoner of war handling. The Americans had requisitioned the castle of Kranzberg, known as Schloss Kranzberg, a grand estate in the Taunus Mountains northwest of Frankfurt. This was no ordinary prison camp. The facility, codenamed Operation Dustbin, and later Ashcan, had been specifically prepared to house and interrogate high-ranking German military and scientific personnel. The castle's opulent rooms, with their high ceilings and ornate furnishings, stood in stark contrast to the rubble-strewn landscape of defeated Germany. The first group of generals arrived at Kranzberg on a warm afternoon in mid-May. As they stepped from the trucks, exhausted from travel and emotionally drained from defeat, they expected to be herded into cells or barracks. Instead, American officers greeted them with correct military courtesy, checked their names against lists, and escorted them into the castle. The contrast between their expectations and reality created immediate psychological disorientation. Where were the barbed wire compounds? The guard towers? The signs of harsh captivity they had anticipated? Inside the castle, the confusion deepened. American intelligence officers had furnished the facility not as a prison, but as something closer to a high-end hotel under guard. The generals were assigned private or semi-private rooms with actual beds, not bunks or straw pallets. The bathrooms functioned. The windows, while barred, overlooked beautiful gardens and forests. Most shocking of all, the dining arrangements bore no resemblance to prison rations. American soldiers had set up a proper dining hall where the prisoners would take their meals at tables with actual tablecloths. Generaloberst Franz Halder, former chief of the Army General Staff, was among the earliest arrivals. His keen mind, which had planned some of Germany's most successful early campaigns before his dismissal by Hitler in 1942, immediately recognized the Americans' strategy. This was psychological warfare of a different sort, comfort as a weapon, luxury as an interrogation tool. By treating them not as criminals or even ordinary POWs, but as valuable sources of information worthy of respect, the Americans were creating an environment where cooperation seemed rational rather than treasonous. The first meal served at Kranzberg became the stuff of legend. The captured generals, expecting watery soup and black bread, found themselves facing American military rations of a quality that most German civilians hadn't seen in years. There was meat, vegetables, real coffee, items that had become luxuries in blockaded, starving Germany. But the moment that would echo through history occurred when one of the generals, parched from the journey and the stress of captivity, asked an American guard for water. What happened next seemed to encapsulate everything surreal about the situation. The American guard, a young private from somewhere in the Midwest who had probably never imagined he would be serving German generals, returned not with water but with something better. Ice-cold bottles of Coca-Cola beaded with condensation, the distinctive curved glass bottles catching the light. The general stared at the beverage, this quintessentially American product, this symbol of the consumer culture that Germany had dismissed as soft and decadent. The guard opened the bottle with a practiced twist, the satisfying hiss of carbonation escaping into the quiet room. The German officer took the bottle hesitantly, raised it to his lips, and tasted the sweet fizzing liquid. It was cold, genuinely cold, with actual ice floating in glasses provided alongside the bottles. Ice. In a Germany where electricity was sporadic and refrigeration a distant memory, the Americans had ice. The symbolism was overwhelming. Here, in defeat and captivity, the Germans were experiencing a material abundance that their own citizens had been denied for years. The message was clear without being spoken. America's industrial might, its capacity to deliver not just weapons but luxuries to the front lines, had been unstoppable. The Coca-Cola incident marked the beginning of a carefully orchestrated psychological campaign that would transform military interrogation practices. Major John Dolibois, a Luxembourg-born American intelligence officer who would later serve as U.S. ambassador to Luxembourg, was one of the key architects of this approach at Kranzberg. Fluent in German and understanding European military culture, Dolibois recognized that these proud officers would respond better to respect than humiliation, to comfort than deprivation. His innovative methods, while controversial among some of his colleagues who favored harsher treatment, would prove remarkably effective. The ice cream arrived within days of the facility's opening. American supply lines, which had sustained massive armies across thousands of miles, included provisions for ice cream production. The U.S. military had invested in mobile ice cream factories and refrigeration units, considering ice cream vital for troop morale. Now, these same supplies were being diverted to feed captured enemy generals. General Major Dietrich von Kultitz, the former military governor of Paris who had famously disobeyed Hitler's order to destroy the city, sat with a bowl of vanilla ice cream, processing the cognitive dissonance of the moment. He had surrendered Paris to save its treasures from destruction, earning him Hitler's fury and a death sentence in absentia. Now he was eating ice cream in captivity while much of Germany starved. The psychological impact of this treatment extended beyond mere physical comfort. These German officers, steeped in military tradition and hierarchy, found themselves treated with a courtesy that bordered on deference. American interrogators addressed them by rank, listened to their perspectives, and engaged in what appeared to be genuine military-to-military conversations rather than hostile interrogations. General Oberst Georg Thomas, former head of the War Economy and Armaments Office, found himself discussing economic mobilization theory with American officers who seemed genuinely interested in his views, not just extracting intelligence but apparently valuing his expertise. This approach created a subtle but powerful dynamic. Traditional interrogation creates an adversarial relationship, captor versus captive, interrogator versus subject. The Americans were instead creating something closer to a debriefing among professionals. The generals were encouraged to write memoirs, to document their experiences and strategic thinking. They were given paper, pens, and time. The resulting documents would become invaluable historical resources, detailed accounts of German military operations written by the men who had planned and executed them. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, the panzer warfare pioneer, began writing what would become the foundation for understanding German armored doctrine, his work facilitated by the comfortable conditions and intellectual respect he received. The contrast with Soviet treatment of German prisoners was not lost on the captives. Stories filtered through the prison network of generals captured by the Red Army, held in brutal conditions, many dying from disease and malnutrition. The Americans were playing a longer game. They recognized that these officers, particularly those with experience on the Eastern Front, possessed critical knowledge about Soviet military capabilities at a time when the wartime alliance was already fraying. Reinhard Gehlen, the intelligence specialist, understood this perfectly. He began negotiating the terms of his cooperation, eventually forming what would become the Gehlen Organization, a CIA-funded intelligence network staffed by former Wehrmacht intelligence officers. The daily routine at Kranzberg further reinforced the psychological strategy. Meals were served at regular times with multiple courses. The generals could request specific foods within reason. Coffee and cigarettes, precious commodities in post-war Germany, were freely available. The Americans even provided German newspapers and magazines, carefully selected, but still offering connections to the outside world. Outdoor exercise was permitted in the castle grounds under light guard. The prisoners could converse among themselves without constant supervision, though the Americans had naturally installed hidden microphones throughout the facility to capture these unguarded conversations. Evening entertainment became part of the routine. The Americans provided a radio for news and music. Movies were occasionally shown, American films that showcased Hollywood's technical excellence and, subtly, American culture and values. Some officers received visits from family members, emotional reunions that reinforced the message that cooperation would be rewarded. General Major Walter Warlimont, former deputy chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, met with his wife in a supervised but civilized setting that bore no resemblance to typical prison visitation protocols. The abundant strategy served multiple purposes beyond intelligence gathering. It was, in essence, a real-time demonstration of America's war-winning advantage. The Germans had fought with courage, skill, and determination, but they had been buried under an avalanche of American and Allied material production. The Coca-Cola and ice cream were not just treats, they were symbols of an economic system that could produce luxuries alongside weapons, that could project not just military power but consumer abundance across oceans. Every cold drink, every generous meal, reinforced the message. You fought bravely, but you were overwhelmed by an opponent whose resources were functionally unlimited. As weeks passed at Kranzberg, the psychological effects of the luxury treatment began manifesting in ways the American interrogators had anticipated. General Oberst Franz Halder, initially reserved and cautious, began engaging more freely in discussions about operational planning and strategic decision-making. His interrogators, led by officers who had studied at West Point and understood military culture, approached conversations as academic discussions rather than hostile questioning. They asked Halder's opinions on various campaigns, treated his strategic insights with professional respect, and created an environment where sharing information felt less like betrayal and more like professional exchange between military scholars. The technique was particularly effective with officers who had disagreed with Hitler's strategic decisions. Many of these generals harbored deep resentment toward the Nazi leadership, blaming Hitler's interference for Germany's military failures. General Oberst Georg von Küchler, who had commanded Army Group North during the siege of Leningrad, initially maintained the professional soldier's code of silence. But as days turned to weeks, comfortable and well-fed, engaged in respectful conversations with educated American officers, his resistance softened. He began discussing the challenges of operating under Hitler's increasingly irrational directives, the military disasters caused by the Führer's refusal to allow strategic withdrawals, and the impossible positions in which professional soldiers had been placed. The Americans understood that these conversations were gold mines of intelligence. Every discussion about supply line challenges revealed information about German logistics capabilities and weaknesses. Every complaint about Hitler's interference provided insights into the decision-making processes at the highest levels of German command. General Major Rudolf Bamler, who had served in multiple intelligence capacities, found himself in extended conversations about the structure and operations of German military intelligence. The relaxed atmosphere, the good food, the occasional Coca-Cola or ice cream, all contributed to a sense that these conversations were somehow separate from the war, academic exercises rather than intelligence operations. One particularly significant breakthrough came with General Oberst Alfred Jodl, who had signed Germany's surrender documents. Jodl, a true believer in German military supremacy and Hitler's genius until nearly the end, found his worldview shattered by defeat and by the comfortable captivity that followed. American interrogators spent hours with him, sometimes offering little more than coffee and sympathetic listening as he processed his disillusionment. Jodl began providing detailed accounts of the planning for major operations, the internal debates within the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, and the deteriorating relationship between the military leadership and Hitler's inner circle. These debriefings would later prove crucial for historians seeking to understand Nazi Germany's decision-making processes. The ice cream served regularly now had become something of a running joke among the prisoners. General Major Walter Warlimont quipped to a fellow officer that they had lost the war but won the desert war, a dark humor that reflected their psychological adjustment to captivity. The Americans noticed everything: which generals maintained rigid military bearing, which ones were adapting to their new circumstances, which ones showed signs of being willing to cooperate more extensively. The luxury environment was not just about comfort, it was an elaborate sorting mechanism, helping intelligence officers identify which prisoners might be valuable assets going forward. The treatment also served a broader strategic purpose related to post-war planning. American leadership, particularly within the emerging intelligence community, recognized that the next conflict would likely be with the Soviet Union. German military expertise regarding the Red Army was invaluable. Officers like Reinhard Gehlen, with his extensive files on Soviet military capabilities, and General Oberst Rudolf Hoffmann, who had spent years fighting on the Eastern Front, possessed knowledge that could take American intelligence years to accumulate independently. The comfortable treatment at Kreuzberg was partly an investment in future cooperation. Some prisoners struggled with the ethical implications of their situation. General Major Hans Speidel, who had been involved in the July 20th conspiracy to assassinate Hitler, had fewer qualms about cooperating with the Americans. His hands were relatively clean and he saw cooperation as a way to help rebuild Germany along democratic lines. Others, like General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, who had commanded in Italy and bore responsibility for harsh occupation policies and potential war crimes, faced a more complex calculus. The luxury treatment created a cognitive dissonance. How could they be guilty of terrible crimes if they were being treated so well? The Americans were careful to maintain the distinction between intelligence gathering and judicial proceedings. The comfortable interrogation centers like Kreuzberg were separate from the investigation processes preparing for the Nuremberg trials. Officers who had committed or ordered atrocities would eventually face justice, but that was a different process. The intelligence officers at Kreuzberg focused on extracting military and strategic information, not building criminal cases. This separation allowed prisoners to rationalize their cooperation. They were discussing military matters, not confessing to crimes. By late summer of 1945, the operation was yielding enormous intelligence dividends. The Americans had compiled detailed reports on German military organization, tactical doctrines, weapons development programs, and strategic planning processes. They had mapped the structure of German military intelligence and counterintelligence operations. They had identified potential assets for future operations against the Soviet Union. And they had accomplished all this not through torture, deprivation, or threats, but through Coca-Cola, ice cream, comfortable beds, and respectful conversation. The success of the luxury interrogation approach at Kreuzberg and similar facilities did not go unnoticed within the American military establishment. Colonel John Amon, who oversaw several POW interrogation operations, began compiling reports on the methodology and its effectiveness. His documentation, later archived in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, provided detailed analysis of how the comfort-based approach yielded superior intelligence compared to traditional harsh interrogation methods. These reports would influence American intelligence doctrine for decades, though the full extent of the programs remained classified for many years after the war. General Oberst Franz Halder became one of the most prolific contributors to what became an enormous historical archive. Provided with writing materials and encouraged to document his experiences, Halder produced hundreds of pages of detailed military analysis. His accounts of the planning for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, provided unprecedented insight into German strategic thinking. The Americans didn't just take his statements in interview form. They gave him time, space, and resources to write comprehensive memoirs. The same approach was taken with other senior officers, creating a documentary record that historians would mine for generations. The psychological dynamic had shifted so dramatically that some prisoners began to view their captivity almost as a sabbatical. General Major Dietrich von Koltitz, the savior of Paris, found himself in extended discussions with American officers about urban warfare and occupation policies. He was candid about his earlier career on the Eastern Front, where he had been far less merciful than in Paris. The comfortable environment allowed him to process and articulate his own transformation, from a ruthless executor of harsh occupation policies to the man who had refused to destroy one of Europe's greatest cities. His psychological journey, documented in these interrogation sessions, provided valuable insights into how professional soldiers operated under competing ethical demands. Some of the most valuable intelligence came from informal conversations between prisoners that were captured by hidden surveillance equipment. The Americans had wired the dining areas, recreation rooms, and even some sleeping quarters. When generals spoke among themselves, believing they were unmonitored, they often revealed more than they would in formal interrogations. Discussions about technical details of weapon systems, assessments of various commanders' competence, and gossip about internal Wehrmacht politics all provided valuable context. The comfortable environment encouraged these unguarded conversations. Men at ease in pleasant surroundings spoke more freely than men under stress in harsh conditions. The ice cream continued to play its symbolic role. Officers who had commanded armies now stood in lines to receive dessert like schoolboys. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on them, but it also had a humanizing effect. These men, who had wielded terrible power and made decisions that cost millions of lives, were being reminded of simple pleasures. Some prisoners later reported that these small comforts helped them maintain their sanity, providing psychological anchors during a period of profound disorientation and uncertainty about their futures. American intelligence officers also used the comfortable setting to conduct what would now be called stress interviews with select prisoners. The technique involved suddenly shifting from the relaxed, respectful conversations to pointed, aggressive questioning about specific incidents or decisions. The contrast was jarring. A general would be enjoying coffee and cake one moment, then confronted the next with evidence of atrocities committed by units under his command. The psychological whiplash often produced more honest responses than consistent harsh treatment would have yielded. Men caught off guard, comfortable and unprepared for aggressive questioning, sometimes revealed information they would have concealed under sustained hostile interrogation. The program expanded beyond Kransberg to other facilities. Generaloberst Johannes Blaskowitz, who had protested SS atrocities in Poland as early as 1939 and 39 and been removed from command for his objections, was held at a different facility, but received similar treatment. His case illustrated the Americans' nuanced approach. They recognized that not all German generals were equally culpable, and they adjusted their treatment and expectations accordingly. Blaskowitz's documented opposition to war crimes made him a valuable witness and a potential asset for understanding the conflicts between the Wehrmacht and the SS. The approach was not without critics within the American military. Some officers felt that feeding ice cream to enemy generals while American soldiers were still dying in the Pacific campaign against Japan was unconscionable. Others argued that the Geneva Convention required humane treatment but not luxury, and that the resources devoted to comfortable POW facilities could be better used elsewhere. These criticisms were largely overruled by the intelligence community, which argued that the information gained through the luxury treatment was worth far more than the modest costs involved. A few pounds of ice cream and some bottles of Coca-Cola were trivial expenses compared to the strategic intelligence being obtained. By autumn of 1945, with the war against Japan concluded, the interrogation programs entered a new phase. The immediate military intelligence needs had been largely satisfied. Attention shifted toward historical documentation and identifying individuals who might be useful in the emerging Cold War context. General Major Reinhard Gehlen had been negotiating his deal with American intelligence, offering his entire Eastern Front intelligence network and files in exchange for protection and resources. His organization would become one of the CIA's most valuable assets in the early Cold War, a direct outgrowth of the relationships built during those months of comfortable captivity and respectful interrogation. As the interrogation programs continued into late 1945 and early 1946, the moral complexities of the luxury treatment approach became increasingly apparent. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg had begun its proceedings in November, putting senior Nazi leaders on trial for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against peace. Yet many of the German generals eating ice cream and drinking Coca-Cola at American interrogation facilities bore varying degrees of responsibility for similar crimes. The cognitive dissonance between the tribunal's gravitas and the comfortable interrogation centers created tensions within the Allied command structure and among the prisoners themselves. General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, and Generaloberst Alfred Jodl would both eventually stand trial at Nuremberg and be executed for their roles in planning aggressive war and issuing criminal orders. But before their transfer to face justice, both men had spent time in American custody receiving the comfortable treatment. The Americans needed their knowledge about German military operations and strategic planning before turning them over to the tribunal. This pragmatic approach troubled some observers who felt that suspected war criminals should not be pampered, regardless of their intelligence value. The situation was further complicated by the fact that some generals had genuinely opposed Nazi criminality and had even participated in resistance activities. General Major Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had been implicated in the July 20, 1944, plot to assassinate Hitler. He had been arrested by the Gestapo but had managed to avoid execution through the war's end. For men like Speidel, cooperation with the Americans was straightforward. They had already opposed the Nazi regime at great personal risk. Speidel would later become a key figure in rebuilding the German military within NATO, a career trajectory that began during those comfortable interrogation sessions where he provided detailed information about German military operations, while carefully documenting his own opposition to Nazi policies. The differential treatment of various prisoners created its own internal dynamics. Some generals who had committed themselves to cooperation received additional privileges, more comfortable quarters, more freedom of movement within the facilities, access to better reading materials and writing supplies. Others, who remained recalcitrant or were known to have committed serious war crimes, found their treatment less generous, though still within Geneva Convention standards. This created visible hierarchies within the prisoner populations, with compliant officers enjoying markedly better conditions than resistant ones. American intelligence officers faced ethical dilemmas of their own. Major John Dallebois, who had pioneered much of the respectful interrogation approach, later wrote about his internal struggles with the work. He was extracting information from men who had served a monstrous regime, yet he found himself developing professional relationships and even a measure of empathy for some of them. The German generals were not caricatures of evil. They were complex individuals, some of whom had made terrible choices, others who had been swept along by circumstances, and a few who had actively resisted within the constraints of military discipline. Sorting through these moral gradations while maintaining effective intelligence operations required psychological dexterity. The ice cream and Coca-Cola, those symbols of American abundance, took on additional symbolic weight as the ethical complications became more apparent. Every time a general who had commanded units that committed atrocities enjoyed an ice cream sundae, the irony was palpable. The Americans were not naive about this. They recognized the moral dissonance. But they had made a calculated decision that intelligence value and post-war strategic positioning outweighed the satisfaction of harsh treatment. It was Cold War pragmatism beginning to override the moral certainties of the fight against Nazism. Some prisoners struggled deeply with their own guilt and complicity. General Oberst Georg von Küchler, whose forces had besieged Leningrad, causing mass starvation, found the comfortable treatment almost unbearable at times. How could he enjoy these small luxuries when hundreds of thousands had starved to death under his command? His interrogators, recognizing his psychological distress, carefully navigated between extracting information about military operations and not pushing him toward psychological collapse. The luxury treatment was effective for intelligence gathering, but it also created spaces where some prisoners confronted their own moral failures in ways that harsher treatment might not have permitted. The American public, when they learned about these programs years later, through declassified documents and memoirs, had mixed reactions. Many felt that the comfortable treatment was appropriate. After all, these were defeated enemies who posed no threat and were providing valuable information. Others were outraged that war criminals had been treated well while their victims had suffered terribly. The debates over these programs would echo forward through subsequent American conflicts, influencing discussions about interrogation methods, treatment of high-value detainees, and the balance between intelligence gathering and justice. By early 1946, some of the generals were being released from custody or transferred to other facilities as their intelligence value diminished, or legal proceedings against them concluded. General Major Dietrich von Koltitz was eventually repatriated to France, where he faced trial for his earlier actions but received a relatively light sentence due to his role in saving Paris. Others, like Reinhard Gehlen, transitioned directly into working for American intelligence. Still others were turned over to the Nuremberg Tribunal or other courts for prosecution. The legacy of the luxury interrogation approach was complex and multifaceted. On one hand, it had produced an enormous volume of valuable intelligence and historical documentation. The detailed accounts of German military operations, strategic planning, and organizational structures provided by these generals became foundational texts for military historians and intelligence analysts. On the other hand, it had involved treating some war criminals with a comfort and respect that seemed at odds with their actions. The American military establishment ultimately concluded that the intelligence benefits justified the approach, but the moral questions never fully resolved. As 1946 progressed, the nature of the interrogation programs shifted dramatically. The immediate post-war intelligence needs had been largely satisfied, and attention turned increasingly toward the emerging confrontation with the Soviet Union. The German generals who had fought on the Eastern Front suddenly became even more valuable, not as sources of historical information about the recently concluded war, but as experts on the enemy in the next potential conflict. The ice cream and Coca-Cola continued to flow, But now the conversations focused less on what had happened and more on Soviet military capabilities, tactics, and strategic thinking. General Major Reinhard Gehlen emerged as the centerpiece of this transition. His deal with American intelligence was formalized through a series of agreements that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. Gehlen and his intelligence network, composed of former Wehrmacht officers and agents who had operated against the Soviet Union, were essentially hired by American intelligence to continue their work, now on behalf of the United States. The Gehlen Organization, as it became known, received funding, protection, and institutional support. Its headquarters were established in Bavaria, and it began operations that would continue for decades, eventually forming the core of West Germany's Federal Intelligence Service. The moral implications of employing former Wehrmacht officers, some with questionable pasts, to spy on the Soviet Union troubled some American officials, but was ultimately accepted as strategic necessity. The Cold War demanded rapid development of intelligence capabilities regarding Soviet military and political intentions, and Gehlen's network provided immediate capacity that would have taken years to develop independently. The comfortable interrogation centers had served as proving grounds, places where American intelligence officers could assess which German officers were reliable, knowledgeable, and willing to work against the Soviets. The Coca-Cola and ice cream had been, in effect, job interviews. Other generals found different paths forward. General Oberst Hans Speidel, whose anti-Nazi credentials were well established, became an advisor on rebuilding German military capabilities within the emerging NATO framework. His experience and expertise were invaluable for creating a new German military that would be both effective and firmly subordinated to civilian democratic control. The comfortable treatment during his interrogation period had facilitated his transition from defeated enemy officer to valued Allied partner. By 1955, Speidel would be a founding member of the Bundeswehr, West Germany's new armed forces, a remarkable trajectory from prisoner to ally. The interrogation facilities began to close as their missions evolved. Kransberg, the castle that had housed so many defeated generals in comfortable captivity, was repurposed for other uses. The last prisoners were transferred or released, and the hidden microphones were removed. The physical locations disappeared, but the methodologies developed there became embedded in American intelligence doctrine. The recognition that comfort could be more effective than coercion in obtaining intelligence from educated, disciplined subjects would influence interrogation practices for decades, though implementation would be inconsistent and controversial. Some generals who had been held in American custody found themselves transferred to Soviet control as the political winds shifted. The Soviets had been demanding that certain officers be turned over to face Soviet justice for crimes committed on the Eastern Front. General Oberst Rudolf Schmidt and several others were handed over in prisoner exchanges. Their fate contrasted starkly with what they had experienced in American custody. Soviet interrogation methods bore no resemblance to the ice cream and Coca-Cola approach. Many of these officers died in Soviet camps, and those who eventually returned to Germany years or decades later carried the marks of harsh captivity. The contrast between American and Soviet treatment of German POWs became a propaganda tool during the early Cold War. The Americans could point to their humane, even generous treatment of prisoners as evidence of moral superiority and respect for international law. The Soviets, whose own prisoners had suffered terribly in German camps and who had little inclination toward mercy, pursued a harsher path that aligned with their different strategic goals. Germany, divided between East and West, became a laboratory for comparing these different approaches to dealing with former enemies. General Oberst Franz Halder, who had been one of the most prolific contributors to the American intelligence archives, was released from custody in 1947. He settled in West Germany and continued his work documenting German military history, now with American support and encouragement. His multi-volume history of the German General Staff became an essential resource, and his ongoing relationship with American military historians demonstrated how the comfortable interrogation approach had created lasting cooperative relationships. Halder's case illustrated the long-term strategic value of the luxury treatment. He remained a valuable asset years after his initial capture. By 1948, Most of the German generals who had been held in American luxury interrogation facilities had either been released, transferred to face trial, or recruited into various Cold War intelligence operations. The programs themselves had evolved beyond recognition from their origins in the immediate aftermath of German surrender. What had begun as innovative interrogation methods had transformed into recruitment and talent management operations, identifying and cultivating German military expertise for use in the emerging East-West confrontation. The records from these operations remained classified for decades. When documents finally began to be declassified in the 1980s and 90s, historians gained access to the detailed accounts of how the luxury interrogation approach had worked. The files contained not just intelligence reports but also the mundane administrative records, requisition orders for Coca-Cola, invoices for ice cream supplies, meal planning documents showing the careful attention to providing generous rations. These prosaic details helped historians understand the deliberate nature of the comfort strategy. Every bottle of Coca-Cola had been part of a calculated psychological operation. As decades passed and the documents from the luxury interrogation programs were gradually declassified, historians began the complex work of assessing the program's effectiveness, morality, and long-term impact. The records revealed a sophisticated understanding of psychology and motivation that was ahead of its time. American intelligence officers in 1945 and 46 had grasped principles that would later be formalized in academic studies of interrogation effectiveness, that rapport building and comfort often produce more reliable intelligence than coercion and deprivation, particularly with educated, disciplined subjects. Academic studies conducted in the 1970s and 80s, with access to some of the declassified materials, began to document the effectiveness of the luxury approach. Research by military psychologists and intelligence analysts confirmed that the German generals held in comfortable conditions had provided more extensive, more accurate, and more actionable intelligence than comparable prisoners held in harsher circumstances. The contrast was particularly stark when comparing American results with those obtained through Soviet interrogation methods. While Soviet harsh treatment might extract confessions, the American approach yielded detailed, nuanced information that proved far more valuable for understanding complex military and political questions. However, the historical reckoning also had to address the moral compromises involved. Many of the generals who enjoyed ice cream and Coca-Cola bore responsibility for terrible crimes. General Oberst Nikolaus von Falkenhorst, who commanded German forces in Norway, had issued orders for harsh occupation policies. His comfortable interrogation preceded his trial and conviction for war crimes, after which he served a prison sentence. The Americans had extracted his knowledge about occupation governance and resistance suppression before turning him over for prosecution, a sequence that troubled those who believed justice should have been the priority rather than intelligence gathering. The impact on German society and memory was also significant. The fact that many senior Wehrmacht officers had cooperated extensively with the Americans, providing detailed accounts of their operations, influenced how Germans understood their recent history. These officers' memoirs and testimonies produced during their comfortable captivity shaped the narrative of the clean Wehrmacht, the idea that professional soldiers had fought honorably while Nazi Party organizations had committed atrocities. This narrative, convenient for both the Americans who wanted to employ German military expertise